A security camera blinks red in a Los Angeles hospital corridor. What it captures next will be viewed 40 million times and spark a national outcry. A millionaire stomps on his pregnant wife's belly right there in public. Her scream echoes through the halls. Then a doctor comes running and slams the attacker against the wall. But this isn't just a story about one violent moment. It's about what happens when a woman finally fights back against years of silent abuse. Stick with me, because when the truth comes out in court, it changes everything. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from. And if this story moves you, hit that like button. Let's get into it. The security camera in Memorial Hospital's third-floor corridor blinked its small red light at exactly 2:17 in the afternoon. The timestamp in the corner read March 14th, and the footage showed what appeared to be an ordinary weekday. Nurses walked past pushing medication carts. Visitors carried flowers. Everything looked perfectly normal until it wasn't. Claire Brennan sat on the cushioned bench near the consultation rooms, her hands folded protectively over her rounded belly. At 7 months pregnant, every movement required careful thought. She wore a soft blue maternity dress that her husband Douglas had approved that morning. Approval was necessary for everything in their household. What she wore, what she ate, who she spoke to, where she went. Douglas stood beside her, his expensive suit perfectly tailored, his leather shoes polished to a mirror shine. To anyone watching, they looked like a successful couple waiting for a routine prenatal appointment. The camera couldn't capture the tension in Claire's shoulders or the way her fingers trembled slightly against the fabric of her dress. The argument started quietly. Douglas leaned down, his voice low enough that the camera's audio wouldn't pick it up clearly. But his body language told the story. His finger jabbed toward the consultation room door, his other hand clenched into a fist at his side. Claire shook her head, her lips forming the word "please" over and over. What the camera captured next would be replayed millions of times across every social media platform in America. Douglas's face twisted with rage. He grabbed Claire's arm, yanking her upward from the bench. She stumbled, one hand instinctively protecting her stomach. He shoved her backward. Her heel caught on the edge of the bench, and she fell, landing hard on the polished hospital floor. The impact made her gasp, her mouth opening in a silent cry of pain. Then came the moment that would change everything. Douglas lifted his right foot and brought it down with full force toward Claire's pregnant belly. The motion was deliberate, controlled, intentional. His expensive shoe connected with her abdomen, and Claire's body curled inward protectively. Her scream finally reached a pitch the camera could register, a raw sound of terror and agony that echoed down the corridor. For one suspended second, everyone in the hallway froze. A nurse carrying a clipboard stopped mid-step. An elderly visitor clutched the wall for support. Then chaos erupted. From the far end of the corridor, a man in blue scrubs burst through the emergency room doors. Dr. Marcus Hayes was 35 years old, built like someone who'd spent his rare free time in the gym working out grief and anger. He'd been a trauma surgeon for 8 years, and in that time he'd learned to recognize violence instantly. His running shoes made no sound on the polished floor as he sprinted toward the scene. His training took over. Assess the threat. Neutralize the danger. Protect the victim. Marcus grabbed Douglas by both shoulders and slammed him against the corridor wall with enough force to knock the breath from his lungs. The impact reverberated through the hallway. Marcus's forearm pressed across Douglas's chest, pinning him in place. "Don't you move," Marcus said. His voice was deadly calm despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. "Don't even breathe wrong." Douglas's eyes went wide with shock. He stammered, "You don't know who I am." "I don't care who you are," Marcus replied. His eyes stayed locked on Douglas's face, watching for any sign of further aggression. "You just assaulted a pregnant woman. That's all I need to know." Behind them, Nurse Jill Cooper dropped to her knees beside Claire. "Someone call security," Jill shouted. "And get a stretcher up here now. We need labor and delivery on standby." Claire's breathing came in short, panicked gasps. Her hands clutched her belly, feeling desperately for any sign of movement from the baby inside. Tears streamed down her face, but she couldn't find her voice to speak. The pain radiated through her abdomen in sharp waves. Security guards rounded the corner at a run, their radios crackling with urgent codes. Marcus kept Douglas pinned until the officers reached them. Only then did he release his hold. stepping back but keeping himself between Douglas and Claire. "This is a mistake," Douglas said, his voice regaining some of its usual authority. "My wife fell. I was trying to help her up. This doctor attacked me." "The camera caught everything, so," one of the security guards said, pointing up at the small device mounted on the ceiling. "Every single second." Douglas's face went pale. He looked up at the camera, then back at the guard. For the first time, fear flickered across his features. Marcus knelt beside Claire, his trauma surgeon instincts taking over. "Claire, I'm Dr. Hayes. I need you to stay as still as possible. Can you tell me where the pain is worst?" "My baby," Claire whispered. Her voice broke on the words. "Please, my baby." "We're going to take care of both of you," Marcus promised. He looked up at Jill. "Get me a fetal Doppler. I need to check for a heartbeat right now." The stretcher arrived within 90 seconds. The medical team moved with practiced efficiency, carefully lifting Claire onto the gurney while supporting her neck and spine. Marcus kept one hand on her shoulder, maintaining that human connection that told her she wasn't alone. As they wheeled her toward the emergency obstetrics unit, Claire turned her head to look back. Douglas stood between two security guards, his hands being secured behind his back. Their eyes met for one brief moment. His expression held no remorse, no fear for their child, only cold calculation, as if he was already planning his next move. Claire closed her eyes and let the medical team take her away from the man who was supposed to love her, the man who had just tried to kill their unborn daughter. The security camera kept recording, its red light blinking steadily. The timestamp read 2:19 in the afternoon. In those 2 minutes, everything had changed. And somewhere in the hospital's security office, that footage was already being uploaded to the central server, where it would eventually make its way to the entire world. The penthouse overlooked downtown from the 42nd floor, all glass and steel and careful perfection. Claire stood at the kitchen counter, sorting through prenatal vitamins while trying to ignore the growing knot of anxiety in her stomach. The morning sun streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, but the light felt cold. Douglas sat at the dining table with his laptop and a stack of financial statements. His coffee cup sat in exactly the same spot it did every morning, positioned precisely 3 inches from his keyboard. Everything in Douglas's world had its place, including his wife. "Another $47 at the drugstore yesterday," Douglas said, without looking up from the credit card statement on his screen. "What did you buy?" Claire held up the vitamin bottle. "The prenatal supplements Dr. Reeves recommended. The prescription strength ones." Douglas picked up the receipt she'd left on the counter and examined it with the same intensity he'd used for a multi-million-dollar contract. "Generic would be half the price. The doctor said these specific ones have the right levels of folic acid for the baby's development." Claire kept her voice even, non-confrontational. She'd learned that tone mattered almost as much as the words themselves. He crumpled the receipt and tossed it toward the trash can. It missed, landing on the polished hardwood floor. "Pick that up," he said. Claire bent to retrieve it, her pregnant belly making the movement awkward. As she straightened, she felt the baby kick, a small flutter of movement that should have filled her with joy. Instead, it reminded her that she was bringing a child into this house, into this marriage, into this carefully controlled cage. "I'm going out for a while," Douglas announced, closing his laptop. "Business meeting. I'll be back by 6. Make sure dinner is ready." After he left, Claire stood in the silence of the penthouse and felt the walls closing in. She walked to her purse, hidden in the bedroom closet, and pulled out the old prepaid phone she'd bought 3 weeks ago, the one Douglas didn't know about. She had one contact saved in it: Beth Sullivan, her best friend from college, before Douglas had systematically removed every meaningful relationship from Claire's life. Claire's finger hovered over the call button. She wanted so desperately to hear Beth's voice, to tell someone what her life had become, but Douglas had tracking software on all the household computers. He monitored the building's security footage. He had friends in places that made privacy impossible. Instead, she typed out a text message. "I need help, but I don't know how." She deleted it before sending. Then she deleted the draft from the trash folder. Then she turned the phone completely off and hid it again in the bottom of her winter boot, buried in the back of the closet. That afternoon, Claire had her regular prenatal appointment. Douglas insisted on driving her, sitting in the waiting room, controlling every aspect of her medical care, just like he controlled everything else. Dr. Reeves, a kind woman in her 50s, performed the ultrasound with practiced efficiency. "Everything looks healthy," she said, moving the wand across Claire's gel-covered belly. "Strong heartbeat, good growth measurements." The image on the screen showed the tiny form curled inside her. Claire stared at it, memorizing every detail. "Would you like to know the sex?" Dr. Reeves asked. Claire glanced at Douglas. He nodded once, giving permission. "It's a girl," the doctor announced with a smile. "Congratulations." Claire felt tears spring to her eyes. A daughter. She was carrying a daughter. "That's wonderful," she whispered. Douglas's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Only Claire, who had learned to read his every micro-expression, noticed the flash of disappointment. In the car on the way home, he said, "I was hoping for a son. We can try again after this one," Claire offered, trying to smooth over his mood. "A daughter is useless to me," Douglas said flatly. "Can't carry on the family business. Can't build the empire I've created. Just another mouth to feed who'll probably grow up to be as much of a disappointment as her mother." The words hit Claire like physical blows. She pressed one hand against her belly, as if she could shield her unborn daughter from her father's rejection. "Don't say that. I'll say whatever I want. This is my child we're talking about. Mine. You're just the incubator." Claire turned to look out the window, watching the city blur past. She'd known Douglas was controlling, demanding, sometimes cruel, but this was different. This was their baby he was talking about, and he spoke about her like she was already a burden, already a failure, and she wasn't even born yet. That night, after Douglas fell asleep, Claire stood in the nursery they'd been preparing. The room was decorated in pale yellows and whites, gender-neutral colors that Douglas had approved. She ran her hand along the edge of the white crib and imagined her daughter sleeping there, and she made a decision. She couldn't leave. Not yet. Douglas controlled all their money. She had no job, no income of her own. He'd isolated her from family and friends. She had nowhere to go and no resources to get there, but she could prepare. She could plan. She could find a way. Claire walked to her closet and pulled down a small overnight bag from the top shelf. She began packing it slowly, carefully. A change of clothes, the prepaid phone, her old passport that Douglas didn't know she'd kept, the $2,000 in emergency cash she'd been hiding in her winter coat pocket for the past 6 months, $20 at a time taken from grocery money. She knew the security cameras in the penthouse didn't reach into the walk-in closet. Douglas's one blind spot in his surveillance system. Over the next 3 days, Claire researched bus schedules to Oregon, where her older sister lived. She memorized the route. She found a women's shelter that didn't require identification to get in the door. She prepared. On the 3rd day, she was ready to run. She waited until Douglas left for work, then pulled out the packed bag and headed for the door. That's when she heard the key turn in the lock. The door swung open. Douglas stood there with Trent Morrison, his business partner. Both men looked at the bag in her hand. "Going somewhere?" Douglas asked quietly. Behind him, Trent shifted uncomfortably. "Sorry, man, I saw her packing through the bedroom door when I came by earlier. Thought you should know." Claire's heart stopped. Trent had been to the penthouse that morning to drop off documents. She hadn't even known he'd looked into the bedroom, hadn't realized he'd betray her to save his business relationship. Douglas stepped inside and closed the door behind him. The sound of the lock clicking into place was the loudest thing Claire had ever heard. "Put the bag down," he said. "Douglas, please. Put it down, now." Claire set the bag on the floor. Her hands were shaking. Douglas walked over and unzipped it, examining the contents. He found the cash, the phone, the passport. His face remained eerily calm as he pulled each item out and laid them on the counter. "You were going to leave me," he said. It wasn't a question. "I just need some space, some time to think. You need what I tell you to need." Douglas picked up her phone and her ID from the bag. "These are mine now. You're carrying my child, and you'll do exactly what I say until she's born. After that, we'll discuss your future, if you behave." He walked to the bedroom and Claire heard the sound of the door locking from the outside. He'd installed that lock 3 months ago. claiming it was for security. Now she understood its real purpose. "Douglas, please," she called through the door. "I'm sorry, I won't try again. Just let me out." "You'll stay in there until I decide you've learned your lesson," he called back. "There's a bathroom attached. You'll be fine." She heard the television turn on in the living room, volume raised high. The penthouse had excellent soundproofing. She could scream all day and no neighbor would hear a thing. Claire sank onto the bed, her hands cradling her belly. "I'm so sorry," she whispered to her daughter. "I'm so sorry I couldn't get us out." She stayed locked in that room for 16 hours before Douglas finally let her out. 3 days after being locked in the bedroom, Claire woke up feeling wrong. Her head pounded, her vision blurred at the edges. When she tried to stand, the room tilted dangerously. She made it to the bathroom and took her blood pressure with the home monitor Dr. Reeves had recommended. The numbers made her stomach clench with fear. 160 over 105. Dangerously high, especially for someone 7 months pregnant. Douglas was already awake, getting ready for work. Claire appeared in the bedroom doorway, gripping the frame for support. "Something's wrong," she said. "My blood pressure is really high. I need to go to the hospital." Douglas barely glanced at her. "Take some deep breaths. You're probably just anxious." "Douglas, the numbers are in the dangerous range. For me and the baby." He sighed, the sound conveying his immense irritation at the inconvenience. "Fine. Get dressed. I'll drive you. But if this is nothing, we're having a serious conversation about your constant need for attention." The drive to Memorial Hospital took 20 minutes. Claire kept her hand pressed against her belly, feeling the baby move sluggishly. Something was definitely wrong. In the emergency room, the intake nurse took one look at Claire's blood pressure reading and immediately brought her back to a room. Nurse Jill Cooper, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and efficient movements, helped Claire onto the examination bed. "How long have your numbers been this high?" Jill asked. "I just checked this morning, but I've been feeling off for a few days." Jill glanced at the bruises on Claire's wrists, visible when her sleeves rode up. The nurse's expression remained professional, but her eyes held understanding. "I'm going to make a note in your chart that we need to monitor you closely." Douglas appeared in the doorway. "How long is this going to take? I have meetings." "Sir, your wife has dangerously elevated blood pressure. We need to run tests and monitor the baby. This could take several hours." "Several hours," Douglas's voice rose. "For what? To tell her to rest and drink water." Dr. Reeves arrived and reviewed Claire's vitals. Her expression grew serious. "We need to do an ultrasound immediately and check for signs of preeclampsia. If this is what I think it is, Claire might need to be admitted." "Admitted?" Douglas stepped into the room. "That's completely unnecessary." "Mr. Brennan, I understand your concern about costs." "This has nothing to do with costs," he interrupted, though they all knew it absolutely did. "My wife is prone to dramatics. She's probably just stressed." Where Claire spoke quietly from the bed. "I'm not being dramatic. Something is wrong. I can feel it." "You feel whatever you convince yourself to feel," Douglas snapped. "This is a waste of time and money." Dr. Reeves positioned herself between Douglas and Claire. "I'm the medical professional here, and I'm telling you that your wife needs monitoring. Now you can either wait in the lobby or you can leave and come back later, but you're not going to interfere with her care." Douglas's face flushed red. "Do you know who I am? I could buy this hospital." "I don't care if you could buy a whole city," Dr. Reeves replied calmly. "In this room, I'm in charge. Now please step outside." For a moment, Claire thought Douglas might actually hit the doctor. His hands clenched into fists. His jaw worked as he ground his teeth together. But he was in public, surrounded by witnesses. And Douglas Brennan had built his empire on maintaining a perfect public image. "Fine," he said coldly. "I'll be in the waiting area. Don't take too long." After he left, Dr. Reeves squeezed Claire's hand. "You're safe here. We're going to take care of you and your baby." The ultrasound showed the baby in distress. The amniotic fluid levels were lower than they should be. Combined with Claire's blood pressure, it painted a concerning picture. "I want to admit you for observation," Dr. Reeves said. "At least overnight, possibly longer depending on how you respond to treatment." Claire's first instinct was to refuse. Douglas would be furious. He'd see it as defiance, as her trying to embarrass him. But then she felt her daughter move weakly inside her tummy, and she knew she couldn't prioritize Douglas's feelings over her child's life. Okay, she agreed. I'll stay. The doctor smiled. Good. I'll make the arrangements. But when Nurse Jill went to the waiting room to inform Douglas, he refused to leave. He demanded to see Claire immediately. Hospital security was called when his voice grew loud enough to disturb other patients. Finally, Douglas appeared in the doorway of Claire's room. His face was a mask of barely controlled rage. You're not staying here, he said. Get up. We're leaving. The doctor says I need to be admitted, Claire replied, trying to keep her voice steady. The baby needs monitoring. What the baby needs is for her mother to stop being hysterical and come home. I'm staying. Douglas. The words hung in the air between them. Claire had never directly defied him before. She'd learned early in their marriage that disagreement led to consequences. But this was different. This was her daughter's life. Douglas's eyes went cold. Get up, now. No. He took a step toward her bed. Nurse Jill immediately moved to block him. Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. If you don't go voluntarily, security will escort you out. This is my wife, my child. You can't keep me from them. Yeah, actually, I can, Jill said firmly. This is a medical facility and your presence is agitating the patient. Leave now or be removed. Douglas looked at Claire with an expression she'd never seen before. Pure hatred. You're going to regret this, he said quietly. You think you can embarrass me, make me look like the bad guy. You have no idea what I'm capable of. Two security guards appeared behind him. Sir, time to go. Douglas allowed them to escort him to the lobby, but he didn't leave the hospital. He sat in the waiting area, his phone pressed to his ear, making call after call. Claire could imagine who he was talking to, his lawyers, his business partners, everyone in his network who could help him maintain control. Hours passed. Claire's blood pressure came down slightly with medication, but not enough. The baby's heartbeat remained concerning. Dr. Reeves made the decision to move Claire to the labor and delivery floor for more intensive monitoring. It was while being transferred that Claire whispered to Nurse Jill, Please help me. I can't go back to him. Jill squeezed her hand. I'm going to make a note in your chart. Document everything. But honey, you're going to have to be the one to take the next step. We can give you resources, but you have to decide to use them. Claire nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. They wheeled her past the waiting area. Douglas stood up, tried to follow, but the security guards blocked his path. Claire didn't look at him. She couldn't bear to see that cold calculation in his eyes. In the labor and delivery suite, they hooked her up to monitors. The steady beep of her daughter's heartbeat filled the room. Still there, still fighting. Dr. Reeves came in with paperwork. I want to keep you here for at least 48 hours. Your blood pressure is stabilizing, but I'm concerned about early labor. We need to make sure your daughter stays put for at least a few more weeks. Thank you, Claire whispered. Your husband is being quite insistent about seeing you. I don't want to see him. Not yet. The doctor nodded. I'll make sure the staff knows. Try to rest. But rest was impossible. Claire lay in the hospital bed, listening to her daughter's heartbeat on the monitor, and wondered what would happen when she was finally discharged. Would Douglas be waiting? Would he punish her for this defiance? And more importantly, would she ever find the courage to leave for real? Outside her room, Douglas sat in the consultation area near the third-floor elevators. He'd charmed one of the nurses into telling him which room Claire was in. Now he waited, his mind working through scenarios, planning his next move. He wasn't going to let her make him look weak, wasn't going to let her embarrass him in public. She needed to be reminded of who was in charge. Douglas pulled out his phone and sent a text to his lawyer. Need to discuss custody options. Wife is becoming unstable. The reply came back within minutes. We'll prepare preliminary documents. Stand by me. Douglas smiled. He always had a backup plan. 2 days in the hospital had given Claire a small taste of freedom. No one monitoring her every movement. Nurses who treated her with kindness. Meals she didn't have to prepare herself. It felt almost like being human again instead of property. But she knew it couldn't last. Dr. Reeves discharged her on the third day with strict instructions. Bed rest, low-sodium diet, blood pressure checks twice daily, a follow-up appointment in 1 week. Douglas arrived to pick her up wearing his most charming smile. the one he used for business clients and social events. He held her coat, helped her into the wheelchair that hospital policy required, and thanked every nurse they passed. To anyone watching, he was the perfect, concerned husband. In the car, the mask dropped. "You made me look like a monster," he said, his voice flat and cold. "Sitting in that waiting room while they treated me like a criminal. Do you know how many people from my office saw me there? How many business associates?" "I needed medical care," Claire said quietly. "You needed to do what I told you to do." His hands gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. "But you've always been ungrateful. I give you everything. A beautiful home, financial security, and this is how you repay me." Claire stared out the window and said nothing. She'd learned that arguing only made things worse. When they got home, Douglas went to his office and slammed the door. Claire could hear him on the phone, his voice rising and falling as he complained to someone about the hospital bill, the inconvenience, the embarrassment. She went to the bedroom and found her overnight bag exactly where she'd left it when Douglas had caught her trying to leave. A reminder, a warning. That night, Claire barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw her future stretching out before her. Years of this, decades. Raising her daughter in a house where love was conditional and control was absolute. The next morning brought another prenatal appointment. Claire had tried to reschedule it, not wanting to return to the hospital so soon. But Dr. Reeves insisted. After the blood pressure crisis, close monitoring was essential. Douglas drove her in silence. When they arrived at Memorial Hospital, Claire felt a strange mix of relief and dread. Relief to be back in a place where people had treated her with kindness. Dread because she knew Douglas's anger had been building for days. They took the elevator to the third floor. The maternity wing was busy with morning appointments. Claire checked in at the desk while Douglas stood behind her, radiating impatience. "It'll be about 15 minutes, the receptionist said cheerfully. "You can have a seat in the waiting area." Claire walked to the cushioned bench near the consultation rooms. She sat down carefully, her hand automatically moving to her belly. The baby kicked, a strong, reassuring movement. Still there, still okay. Douglas remained standing. He checked his watch, pulled out his phone, sent several text messages. Every movement was sharp with barely contained irritation. "Another bill," he muttered. "Another waste of my money. Douglas, please, not here. Not here." His voice rose slightly. "When exactly am I supposed to discuss the fact that you're bleeding me dry? Every week it's something new. Special tests, overnight stays, premium vitamins. The doctor recommended." "I don't care what the doctor recommended." He leaned down, his face close to hers. "You know what I think? I think you're milking this pregnancy for everything it's worth, playing the victim, making yourself the center of attention." Claire felt tears prick her eyes. "That's not fair." "Fair," he laughed, a harsh sound. "You want to talk about fair? I work 60 hours a week to provide for you. And what do you contribute? Nothing. You're useless." A few people in the waiting area glanced over. Claire felt her face flush with shame. "Please don't do this here." "Why not? Let everyone see what I have to deal with. A wife who does nothing but complain and spend money." "I'm not complaining. I'm just trying to keep our baby healthy." "Our baby?" Douglas's expression darkened. "You mean your meal ticket? Your way to lock me down for child support if you ever work up the courage to leave." Claire's breath caught. He knew, somehow he knew she'd been planning to escape. "I know you, Claire," he continued, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "I know every thought in your head, every pathetic little plan. You're not smart enough to hide anything from me." She looked down at her hands, unable to meet his eyes. "And that baby you're so worried about?" He straightened up, looking down at her with disgust. "I never wanted a daughter. Girls are worthless. Can't build an empire without a daughter. Just another burden I'll have to pay for until she's 18. The words hit Claire like physical blows. She pressed both hands against her belly, as if she could shield her daughter from her father's hatred. "You're horrible, she whispered. "I'm realistic," Douglas corrected. "And you're pathetic." That's when Claire made her decision. She stood up from the bench, her movements slow and deliberate. "I want a divorce," she said, Her voice shook, but the words came out clear. I can't do this anymore. I won't raise my daughter in a house with you. For 1 second, Douglas looked genuinely surprised. Then his face twisted with rage. Sit down, he hissed. No. Sit down. I said no. Claire took a step toward the consultation room, planning to ask the staff to call security, planning to run. Douglas grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh hard enough to bruise. You don't get to leave me. You don't get to embarrass me like this. Claire tried to pull away. Let go. He yanked her backward. Claire stumbled, her heel catching on the edge of the bench. She fell hard, landing on her side on the polished hospital floor. The impact knocked the air from her lungs. Pain radiated up her hip and through her abdomen. She looked up at Douglas, expecting to see concern, expecting him to help her up, apologize, something. Instead, she saw cold calculation. This is your fault, he said quietly. You pushed me to this. Then he lifted his foot and brought it down toward her pregnant belly. Time seemed to slow. Claire watched his expensive leather shoe descend, watched the deliberate way he aimed for her stomach, and understood with perfect clarity that he intended to kill their baby. Her scream tore through the corridor, raw and primal. The impact sent lightning bolts of agony through her entire body. Claire curled inward, her arms wrapped around her belly, trying desperately to protect her daughter. She screamed again, the sound echoing off the walls. People shouted. Footsteps thundered. Someone yelled for security, and then a blur of blue scrubs flew past Claire's line of vision. Strong hands grabbed Douglas and slammed him against the corridor wall with enough force to crack the plaster. Dr. Marcus Hayes had Douglas pinned, one forearm pressed across his throat. Don't you move, Marcus said, his voice deadly calm. Don't even breathe wrong. Douglas struggled, his face reddening. Get off me, this is assault. No, Marcus replied. What you just did is assault. I'm preventing you from doing it again. Security guards arrived at a run. Nurse Jill dropped to her knees beside Claire, her hands gentle as they checked for injuries. Someone get a stretcher, Jill called out, and call labor and delivery. Tell them we have a trauma case coming up. Claire couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything except feel the horrible absence of movement in her belly. The baby wasn't kicking anymore. My daughter, she gasped out. Please, my daughter. Marcus kept Douglas pinned while security took over, snapping handcuffs onto his wrists. Only when the millionaire was fully restrained did Marcus release him and move to Claire's side. I'm Dr. Hayes, he said, his voice gentle now. I need you to stay as still as you can. We're going to get you upstairs and check on your baby, but I need you to breathe slowly for me. Can you do that? Claire tried to nod, but another wave of pain crashed through her. The stretcher arrived. The medical team moved with practiced efficiency, carefully lifting Claire onto it while supporting her back and neck. Every movement sent fresh agony through her abdomen. As they wheeled her toward the elevator, Claire caught one last glimpse of Douglas. He stood between two security officers, his expensive suit rumpled, his carefully styled hair mussed. Their eyes met. This isn't over, he mouthed. Then the elevator doors closed, and Claire was surrounded by the medical team. Nurse Jill held her hand. Dr. Hayes kept his fingers on her pulse, counting silently. Someone placed an oxygen mask over her face. Well, my baby, Claire said again, her voice muffled by the mask. Please tell me she's okay. Marcus pulled a fetal Doppler from the emergency cart. He placed it gently on Claire's belly, moving it slowly as he searched for a heartbeat. For 5 terrible seconds, there was only silence. Then a rapid thumping sound filled the elevator, faint but steady, the baby's heartbeat. She's alive, Marcus said, and Claire saw genuine relief on his face. Your daughter is still fighting. Claire sobbed, her whole body shaking with the force of her tears. Alive, her baby was alive. But as the elevator climbed toward the labor and delivery floor, as the pain in her abdomen intensified, Claire knew this was far from over. Douglas had shown her exactly what he was capable of, and now everyone had seen it too. The camera had caught everything. The video leaked within 6 hours. A hospital worker, whose name would never be publicly revealed, uploaded the security footage to Twitter at 9:30 that evening. No caption, no explanation. Just 40 seconds of Douglas Brennan attacking his pregnant wife in a hospital corridor. By midnight, it had been viewed 3 million times. By morning, it was everywhere. Claire knew none of this. She lay in a private room in the labor and delivery wing, heavily monitored. The baby's heartbeat remained steady, but the doctors were watching for signs of placental abruption, internal bleeding, premature labor, any of a dozen complications that could still end in tragedy. Detective Sarah Wolf arrived at 7 in the morning. She was in her mid-40s with short silver hair and eyes that had seen too much violence. She pulled a chair close to Claire's bed and spoke gently. "Mrs. Brennan, I know you've been through hell, but I need to take your statement while everything is fresh in your mind." Claire nodded weakly. Her voice came out hoarse from screaming. "He tried to kill our baby." "I know, and the video evidence supports that." Sarah pulled out a digital recorder. "With your permission, I'd like to record this. It'll be used in the criminal case against your husband. There's going to be a case. Absolutely, but from aggravated assault, domestic violence, attempted harm to an unborn child. Those are just the charges I can file today. There might be more as we investigate." Over the next hour, Claire told her story. Not just what happened in the hospital corridor, but everything that led up to it. The control, the isolation, the verbal abuse, the time he'd locked her in the bedroom for 16 hours. Sarah listened without interrupting, her expression growing darker with each revelation. "Why didn't you leave?" she asked, then immediately raised her hand. "I'm sorry, that was unfair. I know why women don't leave. I just need to understand for the case." "He controlled everything," Claire said. "The money, my phone, where I could go. I tried once and his business partner told him. Douglas took my ID, my credit cards, everything. Where was I supposed to go?" "Nowhere, Sarah said quietly. "That's what he wanted you to believe. And I'm sorry our system failed you before it got to this point." A nurse knocked and entered with a breakfast tray. "You need to eat," she told Claire firmly. "The baby needs nutrients." After the nurse left, Sarah stood. "I'm going to let you rest, but I want you to know something. Your husband made bail about an hour ago." Claire's blood went cold. "He's out. His lawyers posted $500,000. The judge granted bail with a restraining order. He's not supposed to come within 500 feet of you." Sarah's expression was grim. "But men like Douglas Brennan don't always follow rules. I'm posting an officer outside your room for now. How long will I have to stay here?" "The doctors want to keep you for at least 48 hours. After that, you'll need somewhere safe to go. Do you have family friends?" Claire thought of her sister in Oregon, her mother who'd always told her that marriage required sacrifice. Beth, her college friend who she hadn't spoken to in 2 years because Douglas had forbidden it. "I have a friend," she said finally. "Beth Sullivan, but I don't know if she'd still help me after how I cut her off." "There's only one way to find out." Sarah pulled out her phone. "What's her number?" 20 minutes later, Beth's voice came through the speaker, thick with tears. "Claire, oh my God, are you okay? I saw the video. Everyone's seen the video?" "What video?" There was a pause. "You don't know, honey, the security footage of Douglas attacking you is all over the internet. It's on every news channel. Social media is losing its mind." Claire's hand trembled as she held the phone. "Everyone can see it. Everyone, and they're furious. There are people organizing protests outside Douglas's office building. The hashtag Justice for Claire is trending #1 nationally." Beth's voice cracked. "I should have tried harder to stay in your life. I should have known something was wrong. It's not your fault. He isolated me on purpose." "Well, that stops now. When they discharge you, you're coming to my place. I don't care if I have to carry you myself." After the call ended, Claire asked a nurse to bring her a tablet. She needed to see what Beth was talking about. The first search result made her stomach turn. The video had been shared millions of times. People had slowed it down, zoomed in, analyzed every frame. Her scream had been isolated and turned into audio clips. Her pain had become entertainment for the masses. But as she scrolled through the comments, she realized something. People were angry. Not at her. For her, this is attempted murder. One comment read with thousands of likes, "Lock him up and throw away the key." Every woman who survived domestic violence is watching this and remembering their own story. Another said, We believe you, Claire. But there were other comments too, ugly ones that blamed her. Why didn't she leave sooner? She probably provoked him. Gold digger trying to trap a rich man. Claire closed the tablet and set it aside, feeling sick. That afternoon, a lawyer appeared at her door. Vivian Cruz was Douglas's defense attorney, perfectly tailored in a charcoal suit, carrying a leather briefcase that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Mrs. Brennan, I represent your husband. I'd like to discuss a settlement. Get out? Claire said. If you just listen. I said get out. I'm not interested in being bought. Vivian's expression remained professionally neutral. Mr. Brennan is prepared to offer you $2 million and full custody of the child in exchange for dropping all charges and signing a non-disclosure agreement. $2 million. Enough money to disappear, to raise her daughter somewhere Douglas would never find them, to start over. For one tempting moment, Claire considered it. Then she thought about all the women commenting on that video, the ones saying this happened to me too, and I wish I'd been brave enough to fight back. If she took the money and stayed silent, what message would that send? No, Bo, she said firmly. Tell Douglas he can't buy his way out of this. Vivian's mask slipped slightly, showing surprise. You should think carefully before refusing. The trial process will be brutal. My team will examine every aspect of your life, your mental health, your motivations. We'll prove that you provoked him, that you're an unfit mother. Then do it, Claire interrupted. Do your worst, because I'm done being afraid of him. After the lawyer left, Detective Wolf returned with news. We've subpoenaed Douglas's company records. Turns out you're not the first woman he's hurt. 3 former female employees filed harassment complaints. 2 were pregnant at the time. 1 had a miscarriage shortly after he fired her. Claire closed her eyes. He's done this before, and gotten away with it because he paid people off or intimidated them into silence. But this time there's video evidence. This time the whole world is watching. Sarah leaned forward. Which means he's going to fight even harder to discredit you. Are you ready for that? Claire thought about her daughter, currently measuring her tiny existence in heartbeats on a monitor. Thought about the kind of world she wanted to bring her into. I'm ready, she said. That night, Claire's phone started buzzing with notifications. Beth had given her number to a domestic violence advocate who ran a national support network. Messages poured in from women across the country. Your courage helped me leave my abuser. I've been where you are. You're not alone. Thank you for fighting. You're saving lives you'll never even know about. Claire read each message, tears streaming down her face. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for every woman who'd ever been told she deserved the abuse. Every woman who'd been trapped by fear and isolation. She was fighting for her daughter. Yes, but she was also fighting for all of them. Outside her hospital room, the police officer stood guard. Down on the street, news vans had set up camp. And somewhere in the city, Douglas Brennan sat in his penthouse, surrounded by lawyers, planning his counterattack. The war had begun. Claire was discharged from the hospital after 3 days. The baby showed no signs of trauma, which the doctors called miraculous. Claire called it proof that her daughter was a fighter, just like her mother was learning to be. Beth arrived to pick her up in a beat-up Honda Civic that was nothing like the luxury cars Claire had grown accustomed to. It felt perfect. My apartment's small, Beth warned as they drove through downtown. But it's safe, and Douglas doesn't know where I live. The apartment was in a converted warehouse in the Arts District. 3rd floor, no elevator. Beth helped Claire up the stairs, carrying her small bag of belongings. Everything Claire owned in the world fit in one duffel bag. Somehow that felt liberating. Inside, the apartment was bright and cluttered with plants and bookshelves, a far cry from the sterile perfection of the penthouse. The couch pulls out into a bed, Beth said. You can have the bedroom if you want. I don't mind. The couch is perfect, Claire interrupted. Beth, I can't thank you enough for this. You do the same for me. Beth squeezed her hand. Now let's get you settled. The trial's in 6 weeks, right? The preliminary hearing is next week. The actual trial could take months. Over the next few days, Claire slowly adjusted to freedom. No one monitoring what she ate or wore or said. No one criticizing every choice. She could breathe without permission. But Douglas wasn't going to let her go that easily. On the fourth day, a courier delivered a large envelope. Inside were photographs. Professional quality, clearly taken by someone who knew what they were doing. The first photo showed Claire's sister Margaret, walking into her house in Portland. The second showed Margaret's daughter Emma, Claire's niece, at her elementary school playground. The third showed Margaret's husband getting into his car at work. Underneath the photos was a single typed note. Accidents happen to families who betray me. Drop the charges or everyone you love pays the price. Claire's hands shook so hard she dropped the envelope. Beth grabbed it, read the note, and immediately called Detective Wolf. Sarah arrived within the hour. This is witness intimidation, a felony. I can add this to the charges against him. But can you protect my sister? Claire's voice broke. Can you protect her little girl? Douglas has resources. He could hire someone to hurt them and make it look like an accident. We'll contact the Portland police. Get protection for your family. Sarah's jaw tightened. He's desperate, which makes him dangerous. But it also means he's scared. The video evidence is ironclad. His lawyers know it. So he's resorting to threats. It's working, Claire whispered. I'm terrified. That night, Claire called her sister. Margaret answered on the first ring, her voice tight with fear. Claire, what's going on? There are police cars outside my house. They said Douglas threatened us. I'm so sorry. This is all my fault. No, Margaret interrupted firmly. This is Douglas's fault. And you listen to me. Emma and I are safe. The police are here. We're not going to let him intimidate you into backing down. You hear me? You fight that bastard with everything you have. Claire cried, overwhelmed by her sister's support. After years of Douglas isolating her, convincing her that no one cared, hearing Margaret's fierce loyalty broke something open inside her. The next morning brought more bad news. Douglas's legal team had filed an emergency motion for temporary custody of the unborn child upon birth, claiming Claire was mentally unstable and posed a danger to the baby. Beth read the filing over Claire's shoulder. This is insane. How can they claim you're dangerous when he's the one who attacked you? Because he has better lawyers, Claire said dully. The hearing was scheduled for 2 days away. Claire met with the prosecutor, a sharp woman named Rita Campbell who specialized in domestic violence cases. They're going to argue that your refusal to accept the settlement offer shows poor judgment, Rita explained. They'll bring in a psychiatrist who will testify that you're exhibiting signs of post-traumatic stress and making irrational decisions. Refusing $2 million to let my abuser go free is rational, Claire said. Well, I agree, but Douglas's team is going to paint you as vindictive and unstable. We need to be ready. Rita flipped through her notes. The good news is we have the video. We have the hospital records. We have witness testimony from Dr. Hayes and Nurse Cooper, and we have his history of abusing other women. Will that be enough? It should be. But with someone as wealthy as Douglas, you never know what tricks that commission they'll pull. The custody hearing took place in family court. Claire sat at the plaintiff's table, her hands folded over her belly. Across the aisle, Douglas wore an expensive suit and an expression of wounded innocence. His lawyer stood first. Your Honor, my client is deeply concerned about the welfare of his unborn child. Mrs. Brennan has refused all attempts at reconciliation and is clearly suffering from severe emotional distress. We're asking for temporary custody upon the child's birth to ensure the baby's safety. Rita stood. Your Honor, this is a transparent attempt to control the victim. Mr. Brennan brutally assaulted his pregnant wife in a hospital corridor. The attack was captured on video and witnessed by multiple hospital staff. He's currently facing criminal charges, including attempted harm to an unborn child. The idea that he should have custody is absurd. The judge, a woman in her 60s named Patricia Aldridge, looked unimpressed. I've reviewed the security footage. Counselor, your client attempted to stomp on his pregnant wife's abdomen. What possible argument can you make for custody? Douglas's lawyer didn't miss a beat. The footage shows a man who momentarily lost control due to extreme provocation. Mrs. Brennan had just told him she wanted a divorce in a public setting, deliberately humiliating him. His reaction, while regrettable, was the result of temporary emotional disturbance. Temporary emotional disturbance. Judge Aldridge's voice could have frozen water. He tried to kill an unborn child. He made a mistake in a moment of anger, but his concern for the child's welfare now is genuine. Mrs. Brennan, on the other hand, has rejected all settlement offers, including one that would have provided generously for the child's future. This suggests she's more interested in revenge than in what's best for her daughter. Claire's hands clenched into fists. Everything they were saying was a lie, but it was being presented so smoothly, so professionally. Rita called Dr. Marcus Hayes to testify. He described what he'd witnessed in clear clinical terms. There was nothing temporary or emotional about it. It was a calculated attack on a vulnerable woman. I've treated trauma victims for 8 years. This was deliberate violence. Douglas's team tried to discredit him. Dr. Hayes, isn't it true that you lost your own wife to domestic violence? Doesn't that make you biased against my client? Marcus's expression remained steady. It makes me educated about the patterns of abuse, and I recognize them when I see them. The hearing lasted 4 hours. At the end, Judge Aldridge delivered her ruling. I'm denying the motion for custody. Mr. Brennan, you'll have no contact with the child upon birth until the criminal case is resolved. Supervised visitation may be considered after that, but only if you're found not guilty, which frankly seems unlikely given the evidence. Claire sagged with relief. Beth, sitting behind her in the gallery, squeezed her shoulder. But as they left the courtroom, Douglas's lawyer handed Rita a business card. My client wanted me to remind Mrs. Brennan that the settlement offer expires in 48 hours. After that, we proceed to trial, and I promise you we will destroy her credibility. In the parking garage, Claire broke down. I can't do this. The trial's going to be a nightmare. They're going to tear apart my entire life looking for ammunition. Beth hugged her tightly. Let them try. The truth is on your side. Is it enough? Claire pulled back, wiping her eyes. He has unlimited money for lawyers, character witnesses, expert testimony. All I have is a video and some hospital records. You have something more important, a voice said behind them. They turned to find Dr. Marcus Hayes approaching. Sorry to interrupt. I wanted to make sure you were okay after the hearing. Not really, Claire admitted. Marcus hesitated, then said, My wife's name was Jennifer. She died 5 years ago because her abuser convinced everyone she was crazy, that she was making up the abuse for attention. By the time anyone believed her, it was too late. His voice roughened. I was deployed overseas. Military doctor. I came home to bury her. I'm so sorry, Claire whispered. I tell you this because I need you to understand something. The system failed Jennifer. The lawyers, the police, the judges. Everyone failed her. But you have something she didn't. You have evidence that can't be denied or explained away. That video is going to save your life and your daughter's life, but only if you're strong enough to see this through. Claire met his eyes, saw the pain there, and the determination. I'll see it through, she said. That night, the settlement offer deadline passed. Claire didn't call Douglas's lawyer, didn't ask for an extension, just let it expire. At midnight, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. You just made the biggest mistake of your life. I'll destroy you. Claire showed it to Beth, who immediately forwarded it to Detective Wolf. More evidence, Beth said grimly. He's giving us everything we need to bury him. Or he's just getting started, Claire replied. She didn't know how right she was. The trial was set to begin in 3 weeks. Claire spent her days meeting with prosecutors, reviewing evidence, and preparing her testimony. The baby grew stronger inside her, moving more frequently, reminding Claire every day what she was fighting for. Then Trent Morrison showed up at Beth's apartment. Beth answered the door with Claire hiding in the bedroom, phone in hand, ready to call police. Through the thin walls, Claire heard Trent's voice. I just need 5 minutes. Please. It's important. Claire doesn't want to see you, Bishan, Beth said firmly. You're the reason Douglas caught her trying to leave. I know, and I need to apologize for that. Trent sounded genuinely distressed. But there's something else, something she needs to know about Douglas. Claire emerged from the bedroom. I'm calling Detective Wolf. Whatever you have to say, you can say it in front of her. Sarah arrived within 20 minutes. They sat in Beth's small living room, Trent on one side, Claire and the detective on the other. Okay, Sarah said. Talk. Trent pulled out a flash drive. This contains financial records from Brennan Industries going back 5 years. Douglas has been embezzling from his own company and framing his business partners. I've been helping him because he threatened to destroy my career if I didn't. Sarah took the flash drive. Why come forward now? Because I watched that video like everyone else. Trent's voice shook. I knew Douglas was controlling, demanding, but I didn't know he was capable of that. And I realized that if I stayed silent, I was just as guilty. You turned me in when I tried to leave, Claire said coldly. You're part of the reason I couldn't escape. I know, and I'll have to live with that. Trent met her eyes. But I can help make this right. The financial crimes on that drive could add years to his sentence. And there's something else. He pulled out his phone and played a recording. Douglas's voice came through clearly. Trent, I need you to find out where Claire's sister lives. Get photos of the house, the kids' school, everything. I'm going to make sure Claire understands what happens if she testifies against me. Detective Wolf's expression hardened. When was this recorded? 2 days before the photographs were delivered to Claire. I recorded it because I was getting scared. Douglas was talking about hiring people to stage accidents. He was spiraling. And sure stood. I need to bring this to the DA immediately. Mr. Morrison, you're going to need to make an official statement. And you should probably get your own lawyer because you've admitted to multiple crimes. I know, Trent said. I'm ready to face the consequences. After he left with Detective Wolf, Claire sank onto the couch. Beth sat beside her. Is it bad that part of me feels sorry for him? Claire asked. It means you're a good person. Douglas destroys everyone around him. Trent was just another victim. Beth paused. But he also made choices. He chose to protect himself instead of helping you. That part's on him. The evidence from Trent's flash drive proved devastating for Douglas's defense. The DA added embezzlement and fraud charges to the growing list. More importantly, the recording of Douglas ordering the surveillance on Claire's family proved the witness intimidation beyond any doubt. Douglas's lawyers tried to get the recording excluded, arguing it was obtained illegally. The judge disagreed. Mr. Morrison was party to the conversation. He had every right to record it. With the trial now 10 days away, Vivian Cruz made one final attempt at a settlement. She showed up at the prosecutor's office with a new offer. $5 million, full custody to Claire. Douglas agrees to relinquish all parental rights and have no contact with the child. In exchange, Claire drops all charges and signs a non-disclosure agreement. Rita Campbell didn't even pretend to consider it. Your client is looking at 20 years minimum with the new charges. We're not dealing. 10 million, Vivian countered. No amount of money is going to make this go away. Your client committed felony assault in a hospital corridor, and it was captured on video. There's no settlement that makes that disappear. Vivian's professional mask cracked slightly. Be reasonable. A trial is going to cost the state hundreds of thousands of dollars. Take the settlement and everyone wins. Everyone except the next woman Douglas abuses, Rita said coldly. No deal. After Vivian left, Rita called Claire with the update. I wanted you to hear this from me first. They offered $10 million to make this go away. Claire was silent for a long moment. $10 million. Enough money to never worry about anything again. To give her daughter every advantage in life. But he'd be free, she finally said. Free to do this to someone else? Exactly. Then the answer is still no. I thought you'd say that, which is why I'm going to do everything in my power to put him away for the maximum sentence. The night before jury selection began, Claire went into early labor. She was at Beth's apartment, folding tiny baby clothes she'd bought at a second-hand store, when the first contraction hit. Sharp and unmistakable. It's too soon, she gasped. I'm only 36 weeks. Beth grabbed her keys. That's close enough. We're going to the hospital. At Memorial, Dr. Reeves examined her and delivered the news. The baby's coming. Given your recent trauma, I'm not surprised your body decided to deliver early, but 36 weeks is viable. We're going to get you through this. Labor progressed rapidly. Within 4 hours, Claire was fully dilated. The pain was intense, but every time she thought she couldn't take any more, she felt her daughter moving inside her, fighting to be born. One more push, Dr. Reeves encouraged. Come on, Claire. Bring your girl into the world. With a final surge of effort, Claire pushed, And then the most beautiful sound she'd ever heard filled the room, her daughter's first cry. "She's perfect," the doctor said, placing the baby on Claire's chest. 5 pounds, 6 ounces, small but mighty. Claire looked down at her daughter's tiny face, the delicate features, the shock of dark hair. Tears streamed down her cheeks. "Hi, baby girl. I'm your mama, and I promise you, no one's ever going to hurt you." She named her Hope, because that's what she represented. Hope for a better future. Hope that the fight was worth it. Hope that love could survive anything. Beth stood beside the bed, crying openly. "She's beautiful." Claire. Dr. Marcus Hayes stopped by during his rounds. When he saw Hope sleeping in Claire's arms, his expression softened. "Congratulations," he said quietly. "Thank you for everything. You saved both our lives. You saved your own lives by being strong enough to fight back." That night, Claire held Hope and watched her sleep. Tomorrow, jury selection would begin. The trial would start. Douglas's lawyers would try to tear her apart. But tonight, she had her daughter, safe, healthy, free, and that made everything worth it. The courthouse steps were packed with protesters by the time Claire arrived on the first day of trial. Women held signs reading "Justice for Claire" and "Believe Survivors." News cameras tracked her every movement as Beth helped her navigate the crowd, Hope securing a carrier against Claire's chest. Inside, the courtroom was standing room only. The gallery filled with journalists, domestic violence advocates, and women who'd seen themselves in Claire's story. Douglas sat at the defense table in an expensive suit, his expression carefully neutral. When Claire walked past with Hope, he didn't even glance at them, as if they didn't exist, as if he hadn't tried to kill them both. Jury selection took 2 days. The defense tried to exclude anyone who'd seen the video, which would have eliminated most of the county. Judge Aldridge wasn't having it. "The video has been viewed 40 million times," she said dryly. "If exposure to it is grounds for dismissal, we'll never seat a jury." Finally, 12 jurors were selected, 7 women, 5 men, a mix of ages and backgrounds. Claire tried to read their faces, wondering which ones believed her and which ones thought she was a gold digger looking for a payday. The prosecution's opening statement was delivered by Rita Campbell. She stood before the jury, her voice clear and strong. On March 14th of this year, Douglas Brennan stomped on his pregnant wife's abdomen in a hospital corridor. This attack was witnessed by multiple hospital staff and captured on security footage. It was not an accident. It was not a momentary loss of control. It was a deliberate attempt to harm, possibly kill, his unborn child. Rita played the video, even though everyone in the courtroom had seen it before. Watching it on the large screen made several jurors flinch. Claire looked away, unable to watch herself scream. "The defense will tell you this was an isolated incident," Rita continued. "They'll claim Mr. Brennan was provoked, that he made a mistake. But the evidence will show you a pattern of abuse, control, and violence. You'll hear from hospital staff who witnessed the attack, from police who investigated threats Mr. Brennan made against the victim's family, from former employees who experienced his abuse firsthand." She paused, letting her words sink in. "At the end of this trial, Busting, I'm going to ask you to hold Douglas Brennan accountable for his actions, because no amount of money, no level of success puts anyone above the law." Vivian Cruz stood for the defense. Her opening was smooth, practiced, designed to plant seeds of doubt. "Ladies and gentlemen, what happened in that hospital corridor was a tragedy. No one disputes that. But it was not premeditated violence. It was a man who'd reached his breaking point after months of emotional manipulation." Claire's hands clenched around Hope's carrier. "You'll learn that Claire Brennan married Douglas for his money," Vivian said. "That she isolated herself from friends and family, then blamed him for that isolation. That when he tried to address concerns about the pregnancy, she became hysterical and threatened him with divorce in a public place, deliberately trying to humiliate him." Several jurors leaned forward, listening intently. "My client's reaction was wrong. He knows that. He regrets it deeply. But this was not attempted murder. This was a man pushed past his limits by a woman who knew exactly which buttons to push." Vivian's voice softened. "Douglas Brennan is not a monster. He's a human being who made a terrible mistake, and he's ready to take responsibility for that mistake." What he's not responsible for is the intentional smear campaign being waged against him by a vindictive woman who saw an opportunity to profit from his moment of weakness. The prosecution called its first witness. Nurse Jill Cooper took the stand and described what she'd seen in clinical detail. Mr. Brennan raised his foot and brought it down with force onto his wife's abdomen. There was clear intent in the motion. It wasn't a stumble or an accident, Brennan. It was deliberate. On cross-examination, Vivian tried to shake her testimony. Isn't it possible you misinterpreted what you saw, that Mr. Brennan was trying to help his wife up and accidentally stepped on her? Jill's expression remained steady. No, I know the difference between an accident and an attack. That was an attack. Dr. Marcus Hayes testified next. His account matched Jill's perfectly. When Vivian suggested his own trauma had biased him against Douglas, he didn't flinch. My personal experience taught me to recognize abuse when I see it. That's expertise, not bias. The prosecution played the video again. Then again, each viewing seemed to make the jury more uncomfortable. Good. On day 3, Detective Sarah Wolf took the stand with evidence of Douglas's threats against Claire's family. The photographs of Margaret and Emma, the recording of Douglas ordering Trent to surveil them. This shows a pattern of intimidation and control. Sarah testified. Mr. Brennan used threats to try to force the victim into silence. The defense called its own witnesses. A psychiatrist who'd never met Claire but testified that victims of abuse sometimes exaggerate their experiences for sympathy. Douglas's mother, Rachel, who claimed Claire had always been unstable and attention-seeking. She trapped my son with a pregnancy, Rachel said from the stand. Everything she's done has been calculated to extract money from him. Claire sat stone-faced through the testimony, Hope sleeping peacefully in her arms. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her cry. On day 5, Claire herself took the stand. Rita's questions were gentle, guiding her through her story. Claire described the control, the isolation, the escalating abuse. She talked about trying to leave and being locked in the bedroom, about the hospital attack. When he raised his foot toward my stomach, "What went through your mind?" Rita asked. "That he was going to kill our baby," Claire said quietly, "and that I was powerless to stop him." Several jurors were visibly moved. One woman wiped tears from her eyes. Then came cross-examination. Vivian approached with a sympathetic smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mrs. Brennan, you claim my client controlled all the finances, but you had credit cards, didn't you?" "Yes, but he monitored every purchase." "Because he was being financially responsible. Many couples share financial oversight." Vivian's voice was reasonable, understanding. "Isn't it possible you interpreted normal marital boundaries as control because you wanted to justify leaving?" "No, he gave me a $200 monthly allowance and questioned every expense. You lived in a penthouse apartment worth $6 million. You wore designer clothes. You had access to the best medical care. That doesn't sound like financial abuse to me." Claire's voice strengthened. "Abuse isn't defined by how much money you have. It's about control, and he controlled everything." Vivian spent 2 hours trying to poke holes in Claire's testimony, suggesting she'd provoked Douglas, implying she'd gotten pregnant to trap him, insinuating that her refusal to settle proved she cared more about revenge than her daughter's welfare. By the time Claire stepped down, she was exhausted, but she'd held firm, told the truth without wavering. The defense rested without calling Douglas to testify. Too risky. The video was too damning. Closing arguments took place on day 7. Rita reminded the jury of the evidence, the video, the witnesses, the pattern of abuse. "Douglas Brennan believed his wealth put him above the law," she said. "He believed he could hurt his wife and face no consequences. It's up to you to prove him wrong." Vivian made one last appeal. "My client made a mistake, a terrible, regrettable mistake. But that doesn't make him a monster. It makes him human. Don't let public pressure and media frenzy force you into a verdict driven by emotion rather than justice." The jury deliberated for 8 hours. When they filed back in, Claire held Hope tighter. Beth gripped her hand. The forewoman stood, holding a piece of paper. "On the charge of aggravated assault, we find the defendant guilty." Claire's breath caught. "On the charge of domestic violence with bodily harm, we find the defendant guilty." Douglas's face remained expressionless. "On the charge of witness intimidation, We find the defendant guilty. On the charge of attempted harm to an unborn child, we find the defendant guilty. The courtroom erupted. Judge Aldridge's gavel cracked down. Order. When the room quieted, the judge addressed Douglas. Mr. Brennan, please stand for sentencing. Douglas stood, his expensive lawyer beside him. You used your wealth and position to hurt people, Judge Aldridge said. You thought money could erase your crimes. This court disagrees. For the charges before me, I sentence you to 25 years in state prison, with no possibility of parole for 15 years. You are stripped of all parental rights. You will have no contact with the victim or her child for life. Two bailiffs moved to take Douglas into custody. As they led him away in handcuffs, he finally looked at Claire. His expression held no remorse, only cold fury. But he was going to prison, and Claire and Hope were free. The media circus outside the courthouse was intense. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. Claire kept her head down, Beth clearing a path through the crowd, until they reached the car. Only when they were safely inside did Claire let herself cry. Not tears of pain this time, but relief. It was over. Finally over. Hope stirred in her carrier, making small sounds. Claire lifted her out and held her close, breathing in that sweet baby smell. You're safe now, she whispered. We both are. The victory felt real, but hollow in some ways. 25 years was a long sentence, but Douglas would only serve 15 before being eligible for parole. And Claire knew men like him didn't change. In 15 years, he might come looking for revenge. But that was a problem for future Claire. Right now, she needed to figure out how to rebuild a life. The domestic violence advocacy organization that had supported her through the trial offered her a job. We need someone who understands what survivors go through, the director said. Someone who can speak to them with real authority. If you're interested, Claire was interested. The salary was modest, but it came with purpose. She'd be helping women find the courage she'd had to dig deep to discover in herself. She moved into a small two-bedroom apartment in a quiet neighborhood. Nothing fancy, but it was hers. The lease was in her name. The keys belonged only to her. That freedom was worth more than the penthouse had ever been. Beth helped her furnish the place with second-hand finds and discount store purchases. They painted Hope's nursery a soft lavender, hung cheerful curtains, assembled a crib that only took 3 hours and 2 arguments to put together. Life settled into a new rhythm. Wake with Hope at 6. Feed her, change her, play with her. Go to work at the advocacy center. Come home. Repeat. It was exhausting and beautiful, and nothing like the gilded cage she'd escaped. 3 months after the trial, Claire gave her first public speech at a domestic violence awareness event. She stood at the podium with Hope in a carrier on her chest, facing a crowd of 200 people. I used to think silence kept me safe, she began. Her voice shook slightly, but she pushed through. I thought if I was quiet enough, obedient enough, perfect enough, the abuse would stop. But silence doesn't protect anyone. It only protects the abuser. She talked about the control, the isolation, the fear, about the moment in the hospital corridor when she thought she was going to lose everything. That video saved my life, she said. Not because it went viral, but because it showed the truth in a way that couldn't be denied or explained away. But millions of women suffer abuse that's never captured on camera. Their pain is just as real. Their need for justice is just as valid. When she finished, the applause was thunderous. Women lined up afterward to thank her, to share their own stories, to tell her that her courage had inspired them to leave, to speak up, to fight back. One woman, probably in her 60s, gripped Claire's hand with tears streaming down her face. My daughter was killed by her husband 30 years ago. He served 2 years. I've spent my whole life wishing someone had believed her when she asked for help. Thank you for making people listen. Claire hugged her, both of them crying. That night, Hope was fussy, teething, probably. Claire walked her around the small apartment, bouncing gently, singing off-key lullabies. Through the window, she could see the city lights stretching out in all directions. Somewhere out there were women trapped like she'd been, scared, isolated, believing they had no way out. But also somewhere out there were women who'd seen Claire's story and found the courage to leave. Women who'd called hotlines, gone to shelters, pressed charges, women who'd survived. Hope finally fell asleep against Claire's shoulder. Claire stood at the window a while longer, just holding her daughter, feeling the weight of her small, warm body. "I'm going to raise you different," she whispered. "I'm going to teach you what you are worth more than anyone's control, that your voice matters, that you never, ever have to accept abuse as the price of love." The next morning brought unexpected news. Trent Morrison had been sentenced for his role in the embezzlement scheme, 3 years in minimum security prison, plus restitution. But before being taken into custody, he'd given an interview to a major news network. Claire watched it on her phone while Hope napped. Trent sat across from the interviewer, looking older and more tired than she remembered. "I was complicit in Douglas's abuse of Claire," he said. "I knew he was controlling. I knew something was wrong, but I prioritized my business relationship over her safety. That's something I'll have to live with for the rest of my life." The interviewer asked why he'd finally come forward. "Because I watched that video and saw what my silence had enabled. If I'd spoken up earlier, maybe it never would have gotten that far. Maybe Claire and her baby would never have been in danger." He looked directly at the camera. "If anyone watching this knows someone in an abusive relationship, please speak up. Don't wait for a video. Don't wait for proof. Believe them. Help them. Before it's too late." Claire turned off the video. She didn't forgive Trent, exactly, but she appreciated that he was using his platform to spread awareness. 6 months after the trial, Claire attended the opening of a new wing at Memorial Hospital, the Grace Brennan Center for Domestic Violence Survivors. Her name, but not Douglas's. She'd gone back to her maiden name legally, and Hope had never carried Douglas's surname at all. Hope Williams, a fresh start. Dr. Marcus Hayes found her at the dedication ceremony. "How are you holding up?" "Better than I expected," Claire admitted. "Some days are harder than others, but we're making it work." "Jennifer would have liked you," Marcus said quietly. "She would have been proud of what you're doing. Thank you for everything you did. You saved our lives that day. You saved your own lives by being brave enough to fight back. I just kept him from doing more damage." He paused. "I testified at Douglas's parole hearing last week." Claire's stomach dropped. "Parole hearing, he's not eligible for 15 years. It wasn't a regular hearing. His lawyers tried to get his sentence reduced due to good behavior and overcrowding concerns. The parole board denied it unanimously, especially after I showed them the new evidence." "New evidence?" Marcus pulled out his phone and showed her a news article. Another woman had come forward. Douglas's first wife from 20 years ago. She'd been paid off and forced to sign an NDA, but after seeing Claire's trial, she'd decided to speak anyway. "He beat her so badly she miscarried," Marcus said quietly. "He paid her $5 million to stay quiet and disappear. She violated the NDA to testify at the parole hearing. Douglas will serve his full 25 years now. Maybe more if they file new charges based on her testimony." Claire read the article with shaking hands. Another woman? Another baby lost to Douglas's violence. If she'd taken the settlement money and stayed silent, would there have been another victim after her? "She's suing to get her NDA invalidated," Marcus continued, "going public with everything. Your case gave her the courage to come forward." That night, Claire couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about Douglas's first wife, about the baby she'd lost, about the decades of silence she'd endured. She pulled out her laptop and started writing. Not for herself, but for all of them. The survivors who'd never gotten justice. The ones who'd stayed silent because they thought no one would believe them. She wrote about the patterns of abuse, the isolation, the control, the ways abusers convinced their victims that they were the problem. She wrote about finding the strength to leave, and how that strength looked different for everyone. When she finished, she had a 20-page document. She sent it to the domestic violence organization she worked for. "I don't know if this is useful, but maybe it could help someone." They published it on their website the next day. Within a week, it had been shared thousands of times. Women commented saying, "This is exactly what I went through, and I thought I was the only one." Claire's inbox filled with messages, some from survivors thanking her, some from women currently trapped, asking for advice. She answered every single one, even when it meant staying up until midnight while Hope slept, because she remembered what it felt like to think she was alone. And if sharing her story meant even one woman realized she wasn't alone, It was worth it. 1 year after the trial, Claire stood in front of the bathroom mirror, adjusting the collar of her dress. Hope played on the floor with soft blocks, babbling happily to herself. Today was the dedication ceremony for the new advocacy center. Built with donations that poured in after the trial, the center would provide legal aid, counseling, and emergency housing for domestic violence survivors. Beth arrived to help with Hope. You ready for this? I think so. Claire picked up her daughter and kissed her forehead. Hope giggled and grabbed a handful of her mother's hair. We're ready. The center was in a renovated building downtown, deliberately located near public transportation and legal aid offices. The lobby was warm and welcoming, with comfortable furniture and bright artwork. Nothing institutional or sterile. Claire had fought hard for that. Survivors needed to feel safe, not processed. The ceremony drew a huge crowd: domestic violence advocates, local politicians, journalists, and dozens of survivors who'd found the courage to leave abusive situations. Detective Sarah Wolf was there, now retired but still advocating. Nurse Jill Cooper came with several colleagues from Memorial Hospital. Dr. Marcus Hayes stood near the back, surveying the space thoughtfully. Laura Brennan, Douglas's first wife, sat in the front row. She was in her 50s now, her dark hair streaked with silver. When she saw Claire, she stood and they embraced. Thank you for speaking up, Claire said. You didn't have to violate the NDA. Yes, I did, Laura replied. I stayed silent for 20 years and it nearly destroyed me. When I saw what you did, I realized I could too. Better late than never. Claire was called to the podium. She stood before the crowd with Hope on her hip, her daughter's small hand tangled in her necklace. A year and a half ago, I thought my life was over, she began. I was trapped in an abusive marriage with no money, no support system, and a baby on the way. I tried to leave and was caught. I was locked in a room for 16 hours. I was told I was worthless. She paused, feeling Hope's heartbeat against her chest. Then my husband tried to kill our unborn daughter in a hospital corridor. And that moment, as terrible as it was, became the moment everything changed. Because it was witnessed. It was recorded. It couldn't be denied or explained away. Claire's voice strengthened. But most abuse isn't captured on video. Most survivors don't get their moment of undeniable proof. They're told they're exaggerating, being dramatic, asking for it. Several people in the crowd nodded, recognizing their own experiences. This center exists for all of you, the ones with proof and the ones without, the ones who can leave today and the ones who need more time. You are believed here. You are supported here. You are safe here. The applause started slowly, then built into a roar. People stood. Some were crying. After the ceremony, Claire spent hours talking to survivors. One young woman, barely 20, approached shyly. My boyfriend started getting controlling, checking my phone, getting angry if I talked to other guys. But then I saw your video and I realized it starts small. I left him last month. Claire hugged her. You saved yourself. That takes incredible strength. As the sun set, Claire found herself alone in the center's courtyard. Marcus Hayes found her there. Hell of a turnout, he said. I never imagined it would become this big. Claire admitted. When I pressed charges, I just wanted justice for me and Hope. That's what makes it authentic. Marcus sat beside his. Jennifer would have been so proud. Hope started fussing in her stroller. Claire lifted her out and the baby immediately calmed, snuggling into her mother's neck. She's beautiful, Marcus said. Thank God she looks like me. Claire replied with a slight smile. The interview with the Times ran the following week under the headline, From Victim to Advocate, How Claire Williams Turned Tragedy into Hope. The part that went viral was Claire's final message to women currently trapped in abusive situations. Your life has value. Your safety matters. You deserve better than fear and control. And when you're ready to leave, there are people who will help you. You're not alone. You never were. The article was shared millions of times. Claire's inbox exploded with messages from women saying those words had given them courage to leave, to call a hotline, to tell someone what was happening. On Hope's first birthday, Claire threw a small party at the center. Beth made a cake shaped like a butterfly. Hope smashed it enthusiastically, getting frosting everywhere. That night, After Hope was asleep, Claire stood at her apartment window looking out at the city. Somewhere out there, women were experiencing their first incident of abuse, planning escapes, testifying in court. Claire couldn't save them all, couldn't prevent every act of violence, couldn't fix a system that too often failed victims. But she could keep fighting, keep speaking, keep providing resources and support. She pulled out her phone and recorded a short video. Just her, sitting in her living room, speaking directly to the camera. If you're watching this, you probably need help. Maybe you're scared. Maybe you think leaving is impossible. Maybe you've convinced yourself it's not that bad. She paused, choosing her words carefully. I was you. I felt all of that. And I want you to know something. Your instincts are right. If you feel unsafe, you are unsafe. If you feel controlled, you are being controlled. Trust yourself. And when you're ready, reach out. There are people who will believe you, who will help you, who will stand beside you while you fight for your freedom. She uploaded the video to the center's social media accounts and went to bed. By morning, it had been viewed over 1 million times. Because Claire's story wasn't just about one woman escaping one abuser. It was about every woman who'd ever been told she was crazy, dramatic, asking for it. Every woman who'd been isolated, controlled, hurt. It was about survival, about justice, about refusing to let anyone else's violence define your worth. As hope began to stir in her crib, making soft morning sounds, Claire smiled. They had made it. Not just survived, but thrived. The fight wasn't over. It might never be over. But they were winning. One day at a time, one survivor at a time, one voice raised against the silence. That was enough. That was everything.
Push.